Okay, let's unpack this. You might actually be surprised to learn that the escalating trade friction, between the U.S. and China, it goes way beyond just tariffs and economic growth figures.
Hmm.
It's throwing a pretty significant curveball into something absolutely crucial: the global clean energy transition and our climate goals.
Right. It's huge.
Think about the scale of it. China is, well, it's not only the planet's biggest greenhouse gas emitter, but also the world's factory for so much of the green tech we need: EVs, batteries.
Solar panels.
Exactly. Solar panels, a massive part of the supply chain. So what happens when these two sort of economic titans are increasingly at odds?
Well, what's fascinating here, I think, is just how deeply interwoven everything is.
Yeah.
Global systems, right? China's progress or lack of progress on its energy transition and environmental policies sends ripples
Ripples across.
across international trade, investment flows, and fundamentally, the entire trajectory of our shift towards cleaner energy sources. This isn't just some bilateral disagreement. It's a dynamic with the potential to really fundamentally reshape how we power the world.
Exactly. And that's precisely the rabbit hole we're diving into today.
Yeah.
We're going to try and analyze how these U.S.-China trade tensions, alongside the broader global landscape they're influencing, are impacting China's energy transition and its climate policy decisions. Our main lens, the source material for this, is a recent, very insightful analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. They tackle these complex questions head on.
Yeah, it's a great piece. So our mission for this deep dive is pretty straightforward, really. We want to understand the critical ways this trade war could either, speed up, slow down, or maybe even fundamentally alter our path toward a cleaner energy future.
Right. Looking at direct effects, but also the indirect ones.
Exactly. Both the immediate impacts, tariffs, trade restrictions, and those more subtle second or third order effects that might not be immediately obvious.
Okay, so let's get right to it then. What are the most immediate ways these U.S.-China trade tensions are hitting China's, well, their efforts to transition to cleaner energy?
Okay, so the CSIS analysis highlights this strong expectation of a pretty significant drop in trade volume.
Yeah.
Between the U.S. and China, that is. Unless, of course, they manage to find some common ground on reducing tariffs.
Which seems unlikely right now.
Well, it's certainly challenging, and this naturally puts downward pressure on China's economic growth, which, as we know, wasn't exactly booming beforehand.
Right.
So here's where it gets really interesting. How might the Chinese government respond to this economic slowdown? Do they, revert to familiar strategies? Prioritize investment in traditional heavy industries, big infrastructure projects to boost growth?
Which would mean?
Well, if they do that, it could unfortunately lead to a considerable increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Makes their already ambitious climate goals even harder to achieve.
That is a worrying prospect. What specific industries are we talking about, like steel, construction? And what kind of emissions jump could we expect, historically speaking?
Historically, yeah, in downturns, China has often turned to bolstering manufacturing and construction. Very energy-intensive sectors, right? Heavily reliant on coal, other fossil fuels. So if we see a big stimulus focus there, we could anticipate a reversal, maybe, of the recent trend towards lower emissions intensity. The scale. Hard to say precisely, depends on the size and length of the stimulus, but some analysts project it could push China further off track from its own carbon intensity reduction targets for the next few years.
That is sobering, especially when CSIS also points out that China is already projected to miss its own targets for reducing CO2 emission intensity. Apparently, their post-COVID recovery leaned really heavily on manufacturing.
Exactly, which, as I said, isn't exactly a low emissions pathway.
So the trade war could just make that worse.
Precisely. It could really amplify that trend if the sort of urgent need for economic growth overrides those longer-term environmental considerations.
Okay, now let's think about those second-order effects, the less obvious consequences. You mentioned ripples earlier. How do U.S. tariffs on the rest of the world factor into China's energy transition?
Ah, right. This brings up a crucial point about global environmental standards. Think about the European Union. The EU's been actively pushing forward with a whole range of environmental regulations.
Like emission standards for imports, battery rules, things like that.
Exactly, those kinds of things. These regulations essentially create a significant incentive for China to, well, improve its carbon accounting, clean up its manufacturing supply chains, if it wants to keep selling into that lucrative European market.
Okay, I think I see the connection. So if U.S. tariffs mess up the global economy, create instability elsewhere, Maybe the EU feels pressure to ease its own environmental rules to help their companies cope.
That's the potential risk. Yeah. If the EU were to weaken those regulations because of global economic headwinds, China would lose some of that external pressure, that push to adopt greener practices.
Hmm.
And the CSIS analysis also notes those tariffs announced back in April 2025, the ones targeting the EU and much of the world. Now, while the blanket 10% import duty was sort of a pause from maybe more severe initial proposals.
Yeah, replace them for 90 days, I think.
Correct. But the fact that extra tariffs remain on key sectors, automotive, steel, aluminum, that could further destabilize the global economy and indirectly undermine that momentum towards sustainability.
Building on that, this idea that China's economic choices have global fallout, how else might U.S. tariffs on, say, Europe ripple back to China's energy path?
Well, it's a complex web, isn't it?
Yeah.
If tariffs disrupt global supply chains, slow down economic activity in Europe, for example, that could just reduce demand for Chinese goods overall, including some of their clean energy tech. And furthermore, if European companies themselves are struggling, their ability, maybe even their willingness to invest in and enforce really stringent environmental standards might diminish, lessening that external pressure on China again.
It feels like a really delicate balancing act. On one side, tariffs trying to fix trade imbalances, but they could maybe inadvertently sabotage global climate cooperation.
That's a good way to put it. It's a real tension there.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's look inside China. Domestic factors. How significant is internal demand for their own clean energy tech producers?
Oh, it's unequivocally the most critical factor.
Yeah.
Domestic demand. Think about the sheer scale of their internal market. It's huge.
Right.
According to CSIS, there are several key domestic factors we really need to watch, like those recently introduced trade-in programs trying to get people to swap old polluting cars for newer ones, often EVs.
Yeah, I heard about those.
And also various low-carbon demonstration projects happening in different regions. Plus, and this is important, the deployment of solar and wind energy is entering a really pivotal phase. The feed-in tariffs. They're being completely phased out in July 2025.
Phased out. Okay, instability. How? What exactly are feed-in tariffs, and why does removing them create uncertainty?
Good question. Feed-in tariffs are basically guaranteed payments. Governments promise to pay renewable energy producers a set price for every unit of electricity they feed into the grid. It was a key tool to kickstart solar and wind growth.
Okay, so it reduced the risk for developers.
Exactly. Phasing them out means these projects now have to compete directly in the market. Their profitability depends more on fluctuating wholesale electricity prices. Now, long run, this market competition could be good, drive down costs maybe, but short term, it creates uncertainty for investors, for developers, potentially slowing down deployment. And, more broadly, if the overall economic outlook in China turns negative, if there's just this pervasive sense of uncertainty, that could easily lead to less deployment of clean energy tech, both right now and potentially over the longer term.
That makes perfect sense. If businesses or even individuals are feeling pinched financially or just unsure about the future, buying new solar panels or an EV might slide down the priority list. What about the longer-term consequences if deployment slows down?
Well, over the long term, a slowdown could really stifle innovation. It could mean less investment in developing those cutting-edge clean technologies, a slowdown in crucial R&D.
So companies become more risk-averse.
Exactly. Less inclined to fund those truly transformative, maybe riskier projects. The CSIS analysis specifically raises concerns that while the central government in Beijing might keep supporting R&D at some level, programs relying on local government money or private companies, they could face significant cuts.
And collaborations, with the U.S., for instance.
Yeah, perhaps most worryingly, the current trade tensions are definitely casting a shadow over any research collaborations with the U.S., potentially hindering that kind of international knowledge sharing that's actually vital for speeding up clean energy innovation.
So the trade war isn't just about today's trade flows. It could actually hurt the development of future solutions. Wow. Okay, let's delve into the industry structure itself. CSIS mentions industry consolidation and government intervention. What's the dynamic there?
What's particularly noteworthy, I think, is that the Chinese government has actually for some time wanted to see some consolidation in its clean energy tech sector.
Why is that?
Partly to deal with what they call involution. It basically means this state of intense internal competition that leads to diminishing returns, price wars that kill profits, and ultimately that can hinder long-term innovation. Too many companies fighting over scraps.
Okay.
So an economic downturn, while obviously causing short-term pain, could ironically force some of the less efficient or financially weaker players into consolidation. Bankruptcies, restructuring, mergers, buyouts.
And that would strengthen the sector overall, in theory.
In theory, yeah. It could lead to a more streamlined, more resilient, maybe more profitable sector in the long run.
But the reality on the ground might be more complicated. We've seen government intervention before, haven't we?
Exactly right.
Mm.
We're already seeing early signs of local governments stepping in, providing financial help to struggling solar panel makers, for instance.
Propping them up.
Essentially, yeah. Now, that might prevent immediate job losses, local social disruption, but it's also likely to make the existing problem of overcapacity even worse. And this persistent overcapacity issue, that's been a recurring source of trade friction, strained relationships between China and other major economies for years.
So instead of maybe a natural market-driven consolidation making stronger companies, we might see government intervention keeping less efficient ones afloat, which could actually intensify trade tensions later on.
That's a definite risk, yes.
Okay, looking outward again. How are Chinese clean energy tech producers actually adapting to these trade challenges? What are they doing?
Well, they're strategically doing what you'd probably expect, actively seeking out and developing new markets for their products, and increasingly setting up production facilities in other countries, getting closer to those customer bases.
Makes sense. Diversify.
Exactly. The CSIS analysis points to a consistent upward trend in exports EVs, solar panels to places like Asia, Latin America. That's been happening for a few years now, and the expectation is it'll continue in markets where trade barriers are, well, lower.
That's a logical response. If door A gets harder to open, try door B and door C. Can you give some specific examples? Where's this diversification happening?
Sure. Think about Pakistan. The availability of cheap Chinese solar panels has been, frankly, transformative for their energy setup.
Right.
Or Costa Rica. The big influx of EV exports from China has really positioned them as a leader in electric mobility in their region.
Interesting.
And even Europe, facing high energy costs after trying to cut reliance on Russian gas. They've seen a dramatic increase in solar panel imports. Big chunk of those coming from China.
And it's not just developing nations.
Not at all. Brazil is a great example. They don't have explicit national EV targets, but they've seen rapid growth in sales of competitively priced Chinese EVs. And interestingly, Brazil is now actively looking for foreign direct investment, particularly from Chinese companies.
To build factories there.
Exactly, with the aim of becoming a regional manufacturing hub for electric vehicles themselves.
So it seems even countries with their own industrial ambitions might see trade and investment from China as an opportunity for growth, for tech transfer.
Potentially, yes.
Yep.
It's not always seen as purely adversarial.
Okay, let's game out a hypothetical scenario. What if? What if the rest of the world manages to strike some kind of trade deal with the U.S., maybe lower tariffs, but China remains excluded, left out of that framework? How might that play out?
Well, China has already shown it's remarkably adaptable, resilient, innovative in response to U.S. restrictions. The solar industry is the classic example, isn't it?
How so?
To get around U.S. tariffs and also deal with concerns around the Eager Forced Labor Prevention Act, we saw a huge shift. Significant manufacturing capacity moved from mainland China to Southeast Asian countries.
Right, like Vietnam, Malaysia.
Exactly. So as a result, the U.S. now imports very few solar panels directly from China. But a lot of the imported panels are made by Chinese-owned firms or affiliated companies, or they use key components made in China.
So direct bans or tariffs on stuff from China don't necessarily stop the flow of Chinese tech or influence entirely. It just redirects it?
Not entirely, no. It makes it more complex. So if other big economies manage to negotiate lower tariffs, better trade terms with the U.S., while restrictions on China stay put, it's highly probable Chinese companies will explore further relocation, moving production to these more accessible countries.
And those third countries might welcome it.
Some might actively seek it out, attract that foreign direct investment to build up their own manufacturing base, maybe in EV batteries, for instance.
But is the U.S. government likely to just sit back and watch this happen, this kind of strategic maneuvering?
Well, the CSIS analysis really emphasizes that the U.S. government has become increasingly aware of this internationalization of Chinese value chains. There's been a noticeable uptick in scrutiny applied to Chinese firms operating abroad recently.
So what could they do?
We could potentially see stricter rules of origin being implemented, especially maybe under a future administration. For countries suspected of just facilitating transshipment of Chinese goods or relying too heavily on Chinese components.
Okay. closing loopholes.
Trying to, yes.
Hmm.
And interestingly, there are also reports suggesting the Chinese government itself might be getting concerned about potential technology transfer, leakage of valuable IP, especially in things like battery tech, as their own companies expand manufacturing overseas.
Huh. So concerns on both sides about this shift. It's a really intricate web, isn't it? All these interconnected economic and geopolitical interests, potential responses, counter-responses.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It just underscores this continuous dynamic. International trade, technological competition,
Yeah.
it never stands still.
So to try and bring it all together then, it sounds like this U.S.-China trade war is having a really complex, multifaceted impact on China's energy transition. It goes way beyond just the immediate effect of tariffs.
That's precisely right. We're seeing this significant interplay, aren't we? Economic pressures, strategic policy responses from governments, the persistent influence of global environmental rules, and then the adaptive strategies the companies themselves are using.
And the crucial takeaways, if you had to distill it down for our listeners, what should they really keep in mind as they think about this?
Okay, well, first, I think, is the considerable risk that economic stagnation, maybe a renewed focus on traditional heavy industry in China, could indeed slow down progress on their climate goals. That's a real possibility.
Right.
However, second, that external influence, especially from EU environmental regulations, it still holds significant potential to drive change in China's practices. Don't discount that.
Okay.
Third, domestic demand within China remains absolutely critical. That's still the biggest piece of the puzzle for their clean energy tech success. Fourth, the dynamics of industry consolidation, especially how it mixes with government intervention. That's going to keep shaping the sector in important ways.
Consolidation versus bailouts, basically.
Yeah, that tension. And finally, we're seeing clear evidence of Chinese producers strategically diversifying their markets, actively navigating trade barriers, localization, new partnerships. They're not standing still.
Right. So considering all these interconnected parts, the intricate web of global supply chains, the urgent need to meet climate goals, and these ongoing trade tensions, here's maybe a provocative thought for you, for the listener to consider. How will this complex interplay ultimately reshape the landscape of international cooperation on clean energy, development, deployment, and within this evolving global dynamic, who do you foresee emerging as the winners? And who might, unfortunately, find themselves the losers?
It's definitely some food for thought long after our deep dive wraps up.